The cabin sat like a forgotten secret among the towering pines of Cedar Ridge, 30 miles from the nearest neighbor. Martha and Henry Caldwell had emptied their retirement accounts for this place, their last chance at the peaceful life they'd dreamed of for 40 years. But as their German shepherd, Rex, scratched frantically at the hardwood floors on their first night, something felt terribly wrong. Henry knew that sound. After 25 years as a homicide detective, he recognized the desperate whining of a dog who'd found something dead. When the floorboard finally gave way, revealing a hidden staircase descending into pitch darkness, Martha grabbed his arm with trembling fingers. The musty air that rose from below carried the metallic scent of old blood and something else, something that made Rex back away, whimpering. Their dream home had become their worst nightmare, and with their life savings gone, they had nowhere to run. As Henry clicked on his flashlight and took that first step down, one question haunted them both. What kind of monster had they bought this house from? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The beam of Henry's flashlight cut through the darkness like a knife through velvet, revealing crude wooden steps that descended into what appeared to be a basement. The air grew colder with each step, and Martha's breath formed small clouds as she followed closely behind her husband. Rex remained at the top of the stairs, his ears pinned back, occasionally releasing low, anxious whines. "Henry, maybe we should call someone," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible in the confined space. "Call who?" Henry replied, his detective instincts overriding his fear. "The nearest sheriff's station is 40 miles away, and we don't even have cell service out here." The staircase creaked ominously under their weight. Henry counted 13 steps before his foot touched solid ground. The flashlight revealed a concrete floor, surprisingly well maintained for what should have been an old root cellar. The walls were lined with rough-hewn stone, and the ceiling was low enough that Henry had to duck slightly to avoid hitting his head on the wooden beams. But it was what occupied the center of the room that made both of them freeze. A large wooden table dominated the space, its surface stained dark with what could only be dried blood. Leather restraints hung from each corner, and nearby a collection of tools was arranged with meticulous precision on a smaller table. Henry's flashlight beam revealed knives of various sizes, a bone saw, and other implements he couldn't immediately identify, but instinctively knew were instruments of torture. Martha's sharp intake of breath echoed in the chamber. "Oh God, Henry, what is this place?" Henry moved the flashlight slowly across the room, his trained eye cataloguing every detail. Against the far wall stood several metal filing cabinets, and beyond those, what appeared to be a large freezer unit. The entire space had the feel of someone's twisted workshop, organized, purposeful, and terrifyingly functional. "This is where someone was killed," Henry said quietly, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. "Multiple someones, by the look of it." Martha stepped closer to him, seeking comfort in his presence. The real estate agent never mentioned any basement. The floor plans showed just the main level and the loft. "Hidden for a reason," Henry muttered, approaching the filing cabinets. The first drawer was unlocked and slid open easily. Inside, manila folders were arranged alphabetically, each tab bearing a woman's name. Henry pulled out the first file with trembling fingers. The folder contained photographs that made him immediately look away, his decades of police work doing little to prepare him for the methodical documentation of torture and murder. There were also personal items, driver's licenses, jewelry, locks of hair tied with ribbon. "Henry?" Martha's voice was small, frightened. "Don't look in these files, Martha. Go back upstairs. What did you find?" Henry closed the drawer and moved to the freezer. The lock was broken, hanging uselessly from the latch. He hesitated for a moment before lifting the lid, knowing that whatever was inside would change their lives forever. The freezer was empty, but the smell that rose from it left no doubt about its previous contents. Scratch marks scarred the interior walls, and dark stains covered the bottom. "We need to leave," Martha said suddenly, her voice rising with panic. We need to pack up and leave right now." Henry turned to face his wife, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. "With what money? We put everything into this place. The down payment, the renovations we planned. We have maybe $3,000 left in our checking account." The reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were trapped 30 miles from civilization in a house that had been the epicenter of unimaginable evil, and somewhere out there, the person responsible for the horrors in this basement might still be alive. Above them, Rex's whining had stopped. In the sudden silence, they heard something that made their blood freeze, the distinct sound of a car engine approaching through the forest. Margaret's arthritis flared as she knelt beside Ranger, her weathered hands running through his coarse fur. The German shepherd trembled against her, his usual confidence shattered by whatever he'd encountered in that hole. Dark soil clung to his paws and muzzle, evidence of his frantic digging beneath the old oak. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, but Ranger only whined and pressed closer to her legs. Harold emerged from the house carrying a flashlight and shovel, his retirement flannel already damp with perspiration despite the cool October air. At 72, he moved with the deliberate care of a man whose body had served him well but demanded respect for its limitations. "Probably just a rabbit burrow," he said, though uncertainty colored his voice. "Dogs get excited about the strangest things." Margaret stood slowly, her knees protesting. "Harold, look at him, really look at him." Ranger sat rigid between them, his intelligent brown eyes darting between his humans and the disturbed earth. His ears remained pinned back, and a low rumble emanated from deep in his chest, not quite a growl, but a warning nonetheless. Harold directed the flashlight beam toward the hole. What he'd initially dismissed as random digging revealed itself as something more purposeful. Ranger had excavated nearly 3 feet down, and the beam illuminated something that made Harold's breath catch. "That's concrete," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. Harold knelt and brushed away loose soil with his free hand. The rough texture of poured concrete became unmistakable under his fingers. It formed a corner, suggesting a larger structure buried beneath decades of forest floor accumulation. "Could be an old septic tank," he offered, but even as he spoke the words, they felt wrong. The concrete was too smooth, too purposeful, and septic tanks weren't typically buried so far from houses. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The October afternoon had grown colder, or perhaps it was the chill running down her spine. "We need to know what this is, Harold. If there's old infrastructure on the property, it could affect our insurance, our well water." Their life savings, every penny from Harold's modest pension and Margaret's teacher's retirement, had gone into this place. The Victorian house had seemed like Providence when they'd found it, priced well below market value due to its remote location and the previous owner's urgency to sell. Now that urgency felt ominous rather than fortunate. Harold attacked the soil with systematic determination, his accounting background evident in his methodical approach. Margaret held the flashlight while Ranger supervised from a safe distance, his anxiety palpable in the crisp air. 20 minutes of digging revealed a concrete structure roughly 4 feet square. Harold's flashlight illuminated what appeared to be a seam running along one edge, too precise to be a crack, too deliberate to be coincidental. "It's a hatch," Margaret breathed. Harold's hands trembled as he cleared the last of the soil from what was unmistakably a metal handle, corroded but functional. The concrete structure was a cover designed to be opened. "Harold, no!" Margaret's voice carried a warning that came from some primal place. "We should call someone. The county, maybe, or—" "Call them about what?" Harold straightened, his back aching from the excavation. "We don't even know what this is yet. Could be an old root cellar or a storm shelter from decades ago." But Margaret had lived long enough to recognize the difference between innocent curiosity and dangerous discovery. Everything about this felt wrong. The way Ranger had found it, his continued distress, the deliberate concealment, the previous owner's eagerness to leave. "The realtor mentioned the previous owner was elderly," she said slowly. "Lived here alone for 30 years after his wife died. Never had visitors, kept to himself." Harold considered this. 30 years of solitude in these woods, 30 years of whatever secrets lay buried beneath their feet. The handle felt solid despite its age, recently used enough to move without excessive force. "Just a quick look," he said, though Margaret's expression made clear her disapproval. "We need to know what we're dealing with." The metal groaned as Harold lifted the concrete cover. It was heavier than expected, requiring both hands and considerable effort. Margaret trained the flashlight beam downward as the opening revealed itself. A ladder descended into darkness. The walls were lined with the same concrete, professionally poured and finished. The space below extended beyond their flashlight's reach, suggesting something substantial, not a simple storage area, but a genuine underground room. The smell hit them then, not the musty odor of earth and time, but something else, something that made Ranger back away with a sharp bark of warning. Margaret grabbed Harold's arm. "We're closing this right now." But Harold was already seeing their dream retirement crumbling, their life savings trapped in a property that might be worthless, or worse, legally compromised. They needed answers, even if those answers terrified them. 5 minutes, he said, placing his foot on the ladder's first rung. "Just enough to see what we're dealing with." Margaret's protest died in her throat as Harold disappeared into the darkness below. The rain hammered against the windows with increasing fury. As Margaret descended the creaking wooden steps, her flashlight beam dancing across rough stone walls. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a musty odor that made her stomach clench. Behind her, Rex whined softly, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "It's all right, boy," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "We're just taking a look." The basement was larger than she'd expected, extending well beyond the footprint of the house above. Her flashlight swept across the space, revealing a workshop area with a heavy wooden table, metal shelving units, and what appeared to be an old furnace in the corner. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if it had been abandoned for years. Margaret approached the workbench cautiously. Tools hung from pegboard hooks, hammers, saws, chisels, and other implements she couldn't identify in the dim light. But something felt wrong about the arrangement. The tools were too clean, too organized, as if they'd been carefully maintained despite the dust that covered everything else. Rex padded past her, nose to the ground, following some invisible trail toward the far wall. His hackles rose as he approached a section that looked different from the rest. Newer concrete, slightly discolored. He began pawing at the base of the wall, whimpering with increasing urgency. "What is it, Rex? What do you smell?" Margaret joined him at the wall, running her hand along the concrete surface. It was definitely newer than the surrounding foundation, the mortar still lighter in color. Her fingers found an edge, a seam where new concrete met old stone. Her heart began to race as she realized what she might be looking at. A sound from upstairs made her freeze, the front door opening and closing. Henry's voice called out, muffled by the floors between them. "Margaret, where are you?" She should call back, tell him what she'd found, but something held her tongue. Maybe it was the way Rex continued to scratch at the wall, or the feeling that whatever was behind that newer concrete wasn't meant to be disturbed. Not yet. "Down here," she finally answered, her voice barely carrying up the stairs. Henry's footsteps crossed the kitchen floor above, then started down the basement steps. Rex abandoned his investigation of the wall and trotted back to Margaret's side, pressing against her legs as if seeking comfort. "Good Lord, this place is bigger than I thought," Henry said, as he reached the bottom of the stairs, his own flashlight adding to the meager illumination. "Look at all this equipment. The previous owner must have been quite the handyman." Margaret nodded absently, watching Henry examine the tools with interest. She wanted to tell him about the wall, about Rex's behavior, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. Instead, she found herself studying her husband's face in the flashlight's glow, noting how the shadows made his familiar features look almost sinister. "These are professional-grade tools," Henry continued, lifting a heavy mallet from its hook. "This one alone probably cost more than our entire toolkit back home." He hefted the weight of it experimentally, and something in the gesture made Margaret step back involuntarily. "Henry," she said carefully, "don't you think we should call someone? About the basement, I mean. The realtor never mentioned it." He set the mallet down and turned to her with a frown. "Call someone? Why would we do that? This is our house now, Margaret. This just adds value to the property. But what if there are permits involved? Or building codes? What if what? His tone sharpened. "We spent our life savings on this place. We're not going to create problems where none exist." Rex chose that moment to return to the wall, his whining growing more insistent. Henry followed the dog's gaze and noticed the newer concrete for the first time. "Well, would you look at that?" he murmured, approaching the wall. "Looks like our predecessor did some repair work down here." Margaret watched anxiously as Henry examined the same area she had, running his hands along the seam. Unlike her, though, he seemed pleased by the discovery. "This is good work," he said approvingly. Whatever foundation issue he had, he fixed it properly. "See how clean this joint is? Professional job." But Margaret wasn't convinced it was a repair. The shape was wrong, too regular, too rectangular. It looked less like a foundation patch and more like something had been walled up deliberately. Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered ominously. In the brief moments of illumination, Margaret caught a glimpse of something she'd missed before. Scratches in the concrete near the floor, as if something had clawed at it from behind. When the lights steadied, she looked again, but the marks seemed to blend into the natural texture of the concrete. Maybe it was just her imagination, fueled by Rex's obvious distress and the oppressive atmosphere of the basement. But as they climbed back upstairs, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the house. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as Margaret prepared coffee with trembling hands. Neither she nor Frank had slept after their discovery, choosing instead to sit vigil in their living room with Max positioned protectively at their feet. The German shepherd's ears remained perpetually perked, his dark eyes scanning the shadows that seemed more threatening than they had just 24 hours ago. Frank pushed scrambled eggs around his plate, his appetite vanished. "We need to call someone," he said for the third time since sunrise. "Call who?" Margaret's voice cracked. "The police? And tell them what exactly? That we found a room in our basement that wasn't on the house inspection? That room was deliberately hidden, Maggie. Someone went to considerable effort to seal it off. That's not normal renovation work." Margaret set down her coffee mug with a sharp clink. "Nothing about this house feels normal anymore." Max suddenly lifted his head, a low rumble emanating from his throat. Both Frank and Margaret froze, listening. The sound of tires on gravel drifted through the morning air. "Expecting anyone?" Frank whispered. Margaret shook her head, moving to the window. A white pickup truck sat in their driveway, and a man in his 50s climbed out. He wore work clothes and carried a toolbox, but something about his measured movements made Margaret step back from the glass. The doorbell echoed through the house. Max stood immediately, positioning himself between his owners and the front door, hackles raised. Frank approached cautiously. "Can I help you?" "Morning, folks. Name's Dale Brennan. I was the handyman for the previous owner, Mr. Hendricks. Heard through the grapevine that new people had moved in." The voice carried a forced cheerfulness that didn't match the intensity behind the man's pale blue eyes. "Thought I'd stop by, see if you needed any work done. This old place can be finicky." Margaret joined Frank at the door, keeping the chain latched. "That's very thoughtful, but we're settling in fine." Dale's gaze moved past them, scanning what he could see of the interior. Hendricks was particular about this house. Real particular. Sometimes he'd have me work on projects that seemed... He paused, seeming to search for words. "Well, let's just say he valued his privacy. If anything seems off, I'd be happy to take a look. No charge for old time's sake." "What kind of projects?" Frank found himself asking, despite Margaret's sharp look. "Oh, reinforcing certain areas, installing specialized locks. He had me do some basement work a few years back." Dale's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Is everything down there working properly for you folks?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret's pulse quickened as she realized this wasn't a coincidental visit. This man knew about the hidden room. "The basement's fine," Frank said carefully. "Just storage space." "Good, good. Hendricks put a lot of work into that basement. Shame if something were to—" Dale trailed off, his meaning clear. "Well, like I said, if you need anything at all, day or night, here's my card." He slipped a business card through the gap in the door. "I know this house real well. Every room, every corner, every secret it holds." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Margaret watched through the window as Dale returned to his truck, but instead of leaving immediately, he sat there for several minutes, making a phone call while keeping his eyes fixed on their house. "He knows," Margaret whispered, as the truck finally disappeared down their winding driveway. Frank examined the business card. The contact information looked legitimate, but the timing of the visit felt anything but coincidental. The question is, what exactly does he know and who else knows it? Max whined softly, pawing at Frank's leg. The dog had been trying to lead them somewhere all morning, but they'd been too distracted to pay attention. Now, with their nerves frayed and questions multiplying, they followed the German shepherd as he trotted purposefully toward the basement stairs. Instead of heading to the hidden room, Max stopped at the main basement area, sniffing intently at the wall near the old furnace. His behavior was different from yesterday, more urgent, more focused. Frank ran his hands along the wall where Max indicated. "There's something here." His fingers found a slight depression in the concrete. "Maggie, bring that flashlight." The beam revealed what appeared to be numbers carved into the concrete, barely visible unless you knew where to look. A date, 3 years ago. Below it, initials that made Margaret's blood run cold. "DB," she read aloud. "Dale Brennan?" Frank's jaw tightened as the implications became clear. Whatever had happened in this house, their unexpected visitor hadn't just worked for the previous owner. He'd been directly involved in concealing evidence. And now that evidence was hidden beneath their feet, in their dream home, making them unwilling guardians of someone else's darkest secrets. The retirement they'd carefully planned was transforming into something far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. The silence in the basement felt heavier now, pressing against Margaret's chest as she struggled to process what they'd found. Harold remained frozen beside the metal cabinet, his weathered hands trembling as he held the door open. The photographs seemed to stare back at them, dozens of faces captured in moments of terror that would haunt her dreams for years to come. "We have to call the police," Margaret whispered, though her voice seemed to echo unnaturally in the confined space. Above them, Rex paced back and forth, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor in an anxious rhythm. Harold nodded slowly but didn't move. His face had gone pale, and she could see the shock settling into his features like frost on a window. 43 years I worked homicide," he said, his voice barely audible. "I thought I'd seen everything. But this—" He gestured helplessly at the contents of the cabinet. Margaret forced herself to look more closely at the photographs, fighting against every instinct that screamed at her to run. The images were professionally composed, which somehow made them more disturbing. These weren't random snapshots of violence. They were carefully planned, meticulously arranged. The photographer had taken time with each shot, adjusting lighting and angles with the patience of an artist. "Harold, look at the dates," she said, pointing to the small timestamps visible in the corners of several photos. "Some of these go back 20 years, maybe more." He leaned closer, squinting at the tiny numbers. "Jesus Christ! 23 years ago, 18, 15. He paused, his breathing becoming labored. "Margaret, we've been living above a serial killer's trophy room." The weight of that realization settled over them like a burial shroud. Margaret thought about all the nights they'd slept peacefully upstairs, all the mornings they'd enjoyed coffee on the deck, watching the sunrise through the trees. How many bodies might be buried somewhere in these woods? How many families had spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones? A new sound from above made them both freeze. Rex had stopped pacing, and now they could hear him growling low in his throat. Not the playful rumble he made when chasing squirrels, but the deep, primal warning that meant danger. "Someone's here," Harold breathed, moving instinctively toward the stairs. But Margaret grabbed his arm, her grip fierce. "No," she whispered urgently. "What if it's him? What if Brennan isn't really dead?" The growling intensified, followed by Rex's sharp, aggressive barking. Then came the sound that made Margaret's blood run cold. A man's voice, calm and measured, speaking to their dog. "Easy there, boy. Remember me? I used to live here." Harold's face went white as bone. "That's impossible. The realtor said he died of a heart attack 2 years ago." "The realtor lied," Margaret said, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "Or was lied to. God, Harold, what if this whole thing was a setup? What if he wanted us here?" The voice above grew clearer as footsteps moved closer to the hidden entrance. "I know you're down there. Found my little museum, did you? I have to say I'm impressed. Took most people much longer to discover it, but then again most people don't have a dog quite as persistent as yours." Margaret's mind raced. The isolation of the property, which had seemed like such a blessing, now felt like a trap. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Cell phone service was spotty at best. Even if they could call for help, how long would it take anyone to reach them? "There's another way out," Harold whispered, pointing toward the far corner of the basement where Margaret could just make out what looked like another doorway, partially hidden behind stacks of boxes. Most old houses like this have root cellars or storm shelters, might lead outside. Above them, the footsteps had stopped directly over the hidden entrance. Margaret could hear Rex's barking becoming more frantic, punctuated by sounds of a struggle. "You hurt that dog, and I'll kill you myself," Harold called out, his police training overriding his fear. A laugh drifted down from above, rich, warm, and utterly chilling in its normalcy. "Oh, Harold, Margaret. We're going to have such interesting conversations, you and I. I have so many stories to tell you about my previous guests, and about why I chose you specifically for this little homecoming." Margaret felt her knees go weak. Chose them specifically. This hadn't been chance or coincidence. Somehow, Thomas Brennan, very much alive despite what they'd been told, had orchestrated their purchase of this house. But why? What did he want with a retired couple from the city? "The other door," she urged Harold, tugging him toward the far corner. "Now, before he figures out how to get down here." As they crept toward what they hoped was another exit, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were moving exactly where Brennan wanted them to go. Margaret's trembling fingers hovered over the old rotary phone in the kitchen. The weight of what they'd discovered in the basement pressed down on her chest like a stone. She could hear Harold upstairs, the floorboards creaking as he paced back and forth, muttering to himself. Kaiser lay by the back door, ears alert, occasionally releasing low whines that seemed to echo her own internal turmoil. 3 hours had passed since they'd sealed the basement door with an old padlock Harold found in the garage. 3 hours of silence between them, each lost in their own horrific thoughts about what lay beneath their feet. The photographs, the driver's licenses, the personal belongings, all evidence of lives cut short, of families somewhere still wondering what happened to their loved ones. She lifted the receiver, then set it down again. What would she say? How did one even begin to explain that their dream home was built on top of a nightmare? "Margaret!" Harold's voice from the doorway made her jump. His face had aged a decade in the past few hours, deep lines etched around his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. "We need to talk. I know what you're going to say." She turned to face him, straightening her shoulders. "We have to call the police. Those families deserve—" "Do we?" Harold moved to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair with shaking hands. "Think about what happens next, Maggie. Really think about it." She stared at her husband of 42 years, searching his familiar features for the man she thought she knew. "Those people are dead, Harold. Murdered. Their families. We'll get closure, yes. But what about us?" His voice cracked. "This house, everything we've worked for, our entire life savings, it all disappears. You know what happens to a house where murders were committed, where bodies were found?" Kaiser suddenly stood, hackles raised, staring toward the basement door. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "He can smell it," Margaret whispered. "Even with the door locked, he knows what's down there." Harold followed her gaze to their dog, then looked away quickly. "We could sell, pack up tonight, drive to Sarah's place in Phoenix, put the house on the market as is, find some other retirees looking for a forest retreat. What they don't know won't hurt them." "Harold James Mitchell," Margaret's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. "Are you suggesting we sell this house to some innocent family without telling them?" "I'm suggesting we protect ourselves. We didn't kill anyone, Maggie. We didn't do anything wrong except buy the wrong house." She studied his face, seeing desperation there, and fear, but something else too, a cold calculation that chilled her more than the basement had. And if someone else finds that room? If their children are playing and discover what's down there? Board it up first, concrete over the entrance, make it disappear. Kaiser's growling intensified. He moved closer to the basement door, sniffing at the gap underneath. Margaret watched their faithful companion, remembering how he'd led them to this discovery. Would they have been happier, never knowing? Living above that horror, in blissful ignorance? 27 driver's licenses, Harold. 27 people who never made it home to their families. Some of them were barely older than our grandchildren. Harold slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. "I know. God help me, I know. But we're 70 years old, Maggie. This was supposed to be our time. Our reward for working hard, saving every penny, doing everything right. Now you want to throw it all away for people who are already dead?" The phone seemed to mock them from its place on the wall, black and silent and waiting. Margaret thought about their granddaughter Emma's last visit, how excited she'd been about Grandma and Grandpa's secret forest house. She thought about the elderly couple they'd bought the house from, the Hendersons, and their shifty behavior during the closing. Had they known? How could they not have known? "The Hendersons," she said suddenly. "They bought this place from the estate after the previous owner died. They renovated the whole first floor, Harold. They had to have known about the basement." Harold looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "You think they found it and just covered it up? Or they were told about it and decided not to look? The implications hit her like a physical blow, which means they sold it to us, knowing we might find it someday." Kaiser barked once, sharp and urgent. Both Harold and Margaret froze as they heard what their dog had detected first, the distant sound of a car engine growing closer. Margaret moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the long driveway that wound through the trees. A dark sedan was approaching, moving slowly as if the driver was unfamiliar with the winding path. As it drew closer, she could make out 2 figures in the front seats. "Harold," she whispered, her blood turning to ice water. "Someone's coming." The silence in the basement felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of their discovery. Margaret clutched Harold's arm while Max remained at the top of the stairs, his ears pinned back, refusing to descend despite Harold's coaxing whistle. "Smart dog," Harold muttered, sweeping his flashlight across the room one more time. The beam caught something they'd missed earlier, a glint of metal behind the filing cabinets. "There's something else back there." Margaret's grip tightened. "Harold, we should call someone. The police, maybe." "And tell them what? That we found some old photographs and newspaper clippings in our own basement?" Harold moved toward the cabinets, his curiosity overriding his wife's caution. For all we know, Eldridge was writing a book, doing research on local crimes. But even as he said it, Harold didn't believe his own words. The methodical organization, the detailed timeline, the personal items. This wasn't research. This was something far more disturbing. Behind the filing cabinets, partially concealed by shadow, sat an old steamer trunk. Harold's flashlight revealed brass corners green with age and leather straps cracked from decades in the damp basement air. A heavy padlock secured the latch. "We're not opening that," Margaret said firmly, reading his intentions. "We have to know what we're dealing with, Maggie. What if—" Harold stopped mid-sentence as footsteps creaked across the floorboards above them. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that definitely weren't Max. They froze, listening, The footsteps moved from the kitchen toward the living room, then back again, as if someone was searching for something or someone. Harold clicked off the flashlight, plunging them into absolute darkness. Margaret's breathing became shallow, rapid. Above them, Max began barking, not his usual alert bark, but something fierce and protective. "The gun," Harold whispered. "I left it upstairs." The footsteps stopped directly above them. In the sudden quiet, they could hear Max's growling, low and menacing, then a man's voice, unfamiliar and rough. "Easy there, boy. Just looking for your owners." Margaret pressed her face against Harold's shoulder, stifling a whimper. Harold's mind raced through possibilities. A neighbor checking on them? Someone who'd seen their lights? Or something connected to whatever Eldridge had been hiding down here? The basement door creaked open. "Hello down there," the voice called, artificially friendly. "Saw your lights. Thought I'd introduce myself. I'm a friend of Mr. Eldridge." Harold felt Margaret's whole body go rigid. Eldridge had been dead for 6 months. Footsteps began descending the wooden stairs, each creak seeming to echo forever in the confined space. Harold pulled Margaret behind the filing cabinets, both of them crouching beside the mysterious trunk. The darkness felt absolute, but Harold knew that whoever was coming down had only to turn on the overhead bulb to expose them completely. "I know you're down here," the voice continued, closer now. "Found some interesting reading material, did you?" The footsteps reached the bottom. Harold could hear the man moving around, and then the click of the light switch. Nothing happened. Harold suddenly remembered the burned-out bulb they'd noticed earlier. A blessing in disguise. A powerful flashlight beam swept across the basement, much brighter than Harold's small light. The beam passed over their hiding spot once, twice, then stopped on the scattered photographs, still lying on the floor where they'd left them. "Sloppy," the man muttered. "Very sloppy." Harold recognized the voice now. He'd heard it before, but couldn't place where. Recent, though, within the last few days. The beam moved methodically around the room, and Harold knew it was only a matter of seconds before they were discovered. His hand found a heavy object beside the trunk, some kind of tool or implement. He gripped it tightly, knowing that at 72 he was hardly equipped for physical confrontation. Above them, Max's barking had become frantic, accompanied by the sound of claws scratching desperately at the basement door. "Damn dog," the man muttered, and Harold heard him start back toward the stairs. "This isn't over. I know you found something, and I know you're down there. Eldridge was careless, but I'm not." The footsteps retreated up the stairs, and they heard the basement door slam shut. A moment later, the unmistakable sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoed down to them. They were trapped. Harold waited several minutes before turning his flashlight back on. Margaret was shaking uncontrollably, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Who was that?" she whispered. "Don't know, but he knew about this place, knew about what Eldridge was doing." Harold looked at the trunk beside them, then at the scattered evidence of whatever dark secrets their predecessor had been keeping. "And now he knows we found it too." Above them, Max continued barking, but the sound was growing more distant, as if he was following someone outside. They were alone in the basement, locked in with decades of someone else's sins. The flashlight beam trembled in Margaret's grip as she descended the wooden steps behind Frank, each creak echoing through the underground chamber like a death knell. The musty air grew thicker with every step, carrying scents that made her stomach churn. Old blood, chemical preservatives, and something else she couldn't identify but instinctively feared. Rex whined softly at the top of the stairs, his massive frame silhouetted against the kitchen light above. Even their brave German shepherd seemed reluctant to follow them into this hidden world beneath their dream home. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, his own flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead. The beams revealed a space much larger than either had imagined, at least 30 feet long and 20 wide, with concrete walls that looked professionally finished. This wasn't some hastily dug storm shelter. This was purposefully constructed, carefully planned. Margaret's light found the far wall first, where photographs were pinned in neat rows across a corkboard. From this distance they looked like surveillance photos, grainy, taken from afar, capturing people who clearly didn't know they were being watched. Her throat constricted as she realized most of the subjects appeared to be young women. "Frank, we need to call the police. Now." But Frank was moving deeper into the room, drawn by something his flashlight had illuminated along the left wall. Margaret forced herself to follow, though every instinct screamed at her to run back up those stairs and never look back. The left side of the basement housed what could only be described as a workshop. A long metal table dominated the space, its surface stained dark despite obvious attempts to clean it. Above the table, tools hung from pegboard with military precision, knives of various sizes, saws, pliers, and instruments Margaret couldn't identify, but that filled her with dread. Each tool had been meticulously maintained, their edges gleaming even in the dim flashlight beams. "Margaret, look at this." Frank's voice was barely audible. He stood before a filing cabinet, its top drawer pulled open. Manila folders were arranged alphabetically, each tab bearing a woman's name written in careful block letters. With shaking hands, Margaret pulled out the folder marked Sarah M. Inside were photographs of a young blonde woman, walking to her car, entering a coffee shop, sitting at what appeared to be a bus stop. The photos were dated over several weeks, documenting her routine with obsessive detail. At the bottom of the folder was a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Local woman still missing after 3 months." The folder slipped from Margaret's fingers, photographs scattering across the concrete floor. She grabbed another folder at random, Jennifer K., and found the same methodical documentation, photos, schedules, personal information somehow obtained, and another newspaper clipping reporting a disappearance. "There are dozens of them," Frank said, his voice hollow. He was pulling folders out faster now, finding the same pattern repeated over and over. Young women, carefully stalked, meticulously documented, and then gone. Margaret's flashlight found something else that made her blood freeze. In the corner sat an old refrigerator, the kind that locked from the outside. Dark stains marked the floor around its base, and she realized with growing horror what it might have been used for. "We're living above a serial killer's lair," she whispered. The words seemed to echo in the underground chamber, making the reality inescapable. Harold Blackwood, the pleasant elderly man who had sold them their dream home, had been using this basement as his base of operations for who knows how many years. How many women had died in this room? How many families were still wondering what happened to their daughters, sisters, mothers? Frank was examining another section of the wall where newspaper clippings were organized by date. The articles spanned nearly 2 decades, missing person reports, unsolved disappearances, families pleading for information. Some of the faces in the photos were circled in red ink, others crossed out entirely. "Look at the dates," Frank said grimly. "The last one is from just 6 months ago, right before he put the house on the market." Margaret felt her knees weaken. "You think he stopped because he was moving? Or because he was afraid of getting caught?" Frank finished. "Maybe the police were getting too close, so he cleaned up, hid the evidence down here, and sold the house to us." Above them, Rex began barking frantically. The sound was different from his earlier alert. This was urgent, warning them of immediate danger. Margaret and Frank looked at each other with growing panic. "Someone's coming," Margaret breathed. They could hear footsteps on the kitchen floor above, slow and deliberate. The back door, which Frank was certain he had locked, must have been opened. Someone was in their house, and they were trapped in the basement with evidence of crimes that could destroy lives, including their own. Frank switched off his flashlight and motioned for Margaret to do the same. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Margaret sat at the worn wooden table, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. She hadn't slept more than an hour, and the exhaustion pressed against her skull like a vice. Across from her, Harold methodically buttered his toast, the scraping sound unnaturally loud in the silence between them. "We can't pretend this isn't happening," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harold's knife paused mid-stroke. "I'm not pretending anything, Maggie. I'm thinking. For 12 hours? What is there to think about? We found evidence of murder in our basement. We have to call the police. And then what?" Harold set down his knife with deliberate precision. "They investigate, tear apart our property, drag us through months of legal proceedings. The media gets wind of it. Retired couple discovers serial killer's den. Our faces plastered across every news station in the state." Margaret stared at him, searching for the man she'd married 43 years ago. "Since when do you care about media attention more than doing what's right? Since we spent every penny we had on this place?" Harold's voice cracked, and she saw the fear he'd been hiding behind his stubborn pragmatism. "We can't afford to start over, Maggie. This is it for us. This house, this land, it's everything we have left." Outside, Kaiser paced the perimeter of the yard, his ears constantly swiveling toward the house. The dog had been agitated since they'd emerged from the basement, refusing to eat, whining at every shadow. Margaret watched him through the window and felt a kinship with his restlessness. "The families of those people deserve to know what happened," she said. "Do they? Really?" Harold leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Those photos looked old, Maggie. Decades old. Those people are long dead, their families have grieved and moved on. What good does digging it all up do now? It gives them answers. Closure. It gives them fresh trauma, and it destroys us in the process." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She needed air, space to think. But as she moved toward the door, Harold's voice stopped her. "There's something else." The tone made her blood run cold. She turned slowly, dreading what she might see in his expression. Harold pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. "I've been researching our seller, Robert Thorne. Did you know he didn't actually own this property when he sold it to us?" Margaret's legs felt weak. "What do you mean?" "I mean the real Robert Thorne died in 1987. Whoever sold us this house was using his identity. The paperwork, the deed transfer, it's all fraudulent." The room seemed to tilt around her. "That's impossible. We worked with lawyers, had title insurance. Fake documents can fool a lot of people, especially when they're done well. And whoever this was, he was very good at covering his tracks." Harold's voice grew quieter. "Maggie, we don't legally own this house. If the authorities investigate and discover the identity fraud, we'll lose everything and have no legal recourse." Margaret sank back into her chair, the weight of their situation crushing down on her. The money, gone, all of it. We'd be homeless, broke, and potentially facing our own legal troubles for unwittingly participating in fraud. Through the window, she watched Kaiser suddenly stop his pacing and stare toward the tree line. His hackles rose and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Harold, look." He followed her gaze to see their dog backing slowly toward the house, his attention fixed on something in the woods they couldn't see. As they watched, Kaiser's growl intensified, and he began barking with an urgency that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Someone's out there," she breathed. Harold was already moving, grabbing the binoculars from the kitchen drawer. He raised them to his eyes and scanned the forest edge, his face growing pale. "What is it?" Margaret whispered. "There's a man. He's just standing there, watching the house." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "Can you see his face?" "He's too far away, but—" Harold lowered the binoculars, his hands shaking slightly. "Maggie, I think he's been there for a while. Kaiser's been acting strange all morning." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Someone knew about the basement, someone knew what they'd found, and that someone was watching, waiting. "We have to call the police now," she said, reaching for her phone. But Harold caught her wrist, his grip firm. "If we call them, we lose everything. But if we don't—" He looked toward the window where Kaiser continued his frantic barking. "If we don't, we might lose something much worse." The choice hung between them like a blade. and Margaret realized that their quiet retirement dream had become a waking nightmare with no clear path to escape. The basement felt like a tomb as Margaret clutched the photograph, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold it steady. The image showed a young woman with kind eyes and a bright smile, but it was the missing person flyer beneath it that made her stomach lurch. Sarah Chen, age 24, last seen hiking the Cascade Trail, the very trail that bordered their property. "There are more," Frank whispered, his voice hollow as he rifled through the filing cabinet with surgical precision. Each folder contained a life reduced to documentation, photographs, newspaper clippings, personal items sealed in plastic bags. The dates spanned 15 years, and the pattern was sickeningly clear. Margaret's eyes fell on a familiar face among the papers scattered on the metal table. Jenny Morrison, the young teacher who'd gone missing 3 summers ago. The search had consumed the entire county for weeks. Margaret remembered making sandwiches for the volunteer search teams, never imagining the truth lay buried beneath her future home. "Frank, we need to call the police. Now!" Her voice cracked as she backed toward the stairs, desperate to escape the suffocating evidence surrounding them. "Wait!" Frank's tone was sharp, urgent. He held up a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and filled with meticulous handwriting. "Listen to this. Day 127. Subject shows remarkable resilience, adjusting methodology for future acquisitions. The soundproofing in the secondary chamber requires reinforcement." The clinical detachment in the words made Margaret's skin crawl. She noticed Frank's face had gone ashen, his jaw working silently as he processed what they'd found. Behind him, another door stood slightly ajar, and she could see the edge of what looked like a medical examination table. "Don't," Frank said without looking up, somehow sensing her impulse to investigate further. "We've seen enough." But curiosity and horror drew her forward anyway. The adjoining room was smaller, sterile, with drainage systems built into the floor and restraints mounted on the walls. A video camera sat on a tripod in the corner, its lens pointed toward the table. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth as the full scope of the previous owner's activities became clear. Above them, Bear's barking suddenly intensified, punctuated by aggressive growling Margaret had never heard from their gentle dog before. Then came the sound that froze her blood, the distinct creak of their front door opening. Frank's eyes met hers across the basement, both recognizing the impossibility of the situation. They'd locked that door, triple-checked it. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor above, deliberate and confident. Someone who knew the layout of the house intimately. Margaret's mind raced through the possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had the previous owner survived the supposed accident? Was this an accomplice returning to collect evidence? "The journals mentioned a partner," Frank breathed, his finger pointing to a passage about shared interests and mutual assistance. The footsteps paused directly overhead, as if listening. Bear's barking cut off abruptly, replaced by a whimpering that made Margaret's heart hammer against her ribs. She grabbed Frank's arm, pulling him toward what appeared to be a second exit, a narrow staircase leading to an exterior bulkhead door. But as they reached it, they discovered it was chained shut from the outside. The basement lights flickered once, then died completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. Margaret bit back a scream as Frank's hand found hers, squeezing tightly. The footsteps above began moving again, this time with purpose, heading directly toward the basement entrance they'd used. In the darkness, Frank's whisper was barely audible. "There's another way out." The journal mentioned emergency protocols. His phone's flashlight illuminated architectural sketches pinned to the wall, blueprints showing a tunnel system connecting to an old storm drain that emptied near the creek. The basement door opened with a grinding screech of rusty hinges. A beam of light swept down the stairs, followed by the measured descent of someone who'd made this journey many times before. Margaret could see the intruder's silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the confidence of someone returning home. Frank located the tunnel entrance behind a false wall panel, the mechanism still functional despite years of disuse. As they squeezed through the narrow opening, Margaret caught a glimpse of their pursuer reaching the bottom of the stairs. The figure paused, examining the scattered evidence they'd left behind, then spoke into what appeared to be a radio or phone. "They know about the collection. Initiate containment protocol." The words sent ice through Margaret's veins as she realized this wasn't just about covering up past crimes. They'd stumbled into an active operation. As they crawled through the suffocating tunnel, dirt raining down with each movement, she understood that their fight for survival had only just begun. Behind them, she could hear the sound of the tunnel entrance being forced wider, their pursuer already adapting to follow them into the darkness. The storm that had been brewing all evening finally broke as Margaret huddled in the basement corner, her hands trembling around the flashlight. Above her, the floorboards creaked with deliberate, measured steps. Harold was searching for her, but these weren't the shuffling steps of her husband of 43 years. These were the calculated movements of someone hunting. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind the old furnace, trying to quiet her ragged breathing. The photographs scattered around her feet told a story she wished she'd never learned. Dozens of faces, all young, all missing, all connected to this house of horrors she'd naively called home. Thunder crashed overhead, masking the sound of the basement door opening. Margaret clicked off her flashlight and held her breath as Harold's voice drifted down the stairs, unnaturally calm and sing-song. "Margaret, darling, where are you? I know you're down there. Rex told me where you went before I dealt with him." The casual mention of their dog's fate sent ice through her veins. Rex had been trying to warn them all along, hadn't he? All those times he'd growled at Harold, refused to come when called, positioned himself between them during their arguments about the house. The dog had sensed what she'd been too blind to see. Harold's footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. The beam of his heavy-duty flashlight swept across the basement, illuminating the concrete walls she'd once thought would keep them safe from the outside world. Now they felt like tomb walls. "I really didn't want it to come to this," Harold continued, his voice echoing off the concrete. "We were supposed to live out our golden years here together. Just you, me, and my collection. But you had to go snooping, didn't you? Couldn't leave well enough alone." Margaret's mind reeled. His collection. How long had Harold known about what was hidden down here? The real question that made her stomach lurch was whether he'd known before they bought the house, or if he'd known because he was the one who'd created it. She thought back to their house-hunting months, how Harold had been the one to find this property, how insistent he'd been that it was perfect, despite her reservations about the isolation, how he'd handled all the paperwork with the estate lawyer, claiming he wanted to spare her the boring details. "You remember how we met, don't you, Margaret? At that grief support group after my first wife died?" Harold's voice was getting closer. "What you never knew was that I was there recruiting. People in grief are so vulnerable, so easy to manipulate. But you surprised me. You were stronger than the others. I actually grew fond of you." The flashlight beam swept dangerously close to her hiding spot. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut, as if that could make her invisible. Her purse was upstairs with her cell phone. The landline had been cut weeks ago during what Harold had claimed was a routine maintenance issue. "The previous owner and I had an arrangement," Harold continued conversationally. "He provided the location, I provided the expertise. When he got careless and attracted attention, well, let's just say I inherited everything, including his mistakes." Margaret's hand touched something cold and metallic behind the furnace. Her fingers traced the object, a wrench left behind by some long-ago repair job. She gripped it tightly, though she wondered if she could actually use it against the man she'd shared a bed with for over 15 years. "I know you think I'm a monster, Margaret, but I prefer to think of myself as a curator. Every person in those photographs chose to trust the wrong person. They made poor decisions. I simply collected the consequences." The light beam swung toward her corner. Margaret held the wrench with both hands, knowing she'd have one chance at most. Her mind flashed to their wedding day, Harold's gentle smile as he promised to love and protect her. Had it all been a performance? Had she ever known the real man at all? There you are. The light hit her face, blinding her. Margaret swung the wrench wildly, connecting with something solid. Harold grunted and stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering across the concrete floor. The beam spun crazily, casting monster shadows on the walls. Margaret scrambled past him toward the stairs, but Harold's hand caught her ankle. She crashed down hard, her chin bouncing off the concrete step. Blood filled her mouth as she kicked frantically at his grasping fingers. "I really am sorry it has to be this way," Harold panted, pulling her back down the steps. "But you've seen too much now, and frankly, after 40 years of pretending to be someone else, I'm tired of the charade." Margaret's vision blurred, whether from the head impact or sheer terror she couldn't tell. As Harold's grip tightened around her throat, she wondered if anyone would ever think to look for them in this god-forsaken place, or if they'd simply become part of his collection. The morning light filtering through the kitchen window felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of what lay beneath their feet. Margaret sat at the table, her coffee growing cold as she stared at the photographs spread before her. Each image was a testament to unspeakable horror, faces of young women frozen in their final moments of terror. Harold paced behind her, his footsteps wearing a path in the wooden floor. "We have to call the police," he said for the 3rd time in an hour. "This isn't something we can handle ourselves." "And tell them what?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "That we've been living above a murder chamber for weeks. That we found evidence and didn't report it immediately." Kaiser lay in the corner, his intelligent eyes tracking their movements. The dog had been restless since their discovery, occasionally whining and pawing at the floor as if sensing the evil that permeated the house. "Didn't we?" She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed from crying and lack of sleep. The scratching noises, Kaiser's behavior, the way the real estate agent was so eager to sell. Part of me knew something was wrong. The photographs told a story neither of them wanted to read. Young women, all with similar features. Dark hair, slight builds, probably in their 20s. The timestamps on the Polaroids spanned nearly a decade. 10 years of systematic murder in the house they'd bought with their life savings. Harold sat down heavily across from her. "What about the other things we found? The journals, the implements?" Margaret shuddered. They'd only scratched the surface of what was hidden in that basement. Detailed journals describing each victim, their routines, how they'd been selected and taken, surgical instruments that had clearly been used for purposes far from medical, and worst of all, the videos they'd been too horrified to watch beyond the first few seconds. "The previous owner," Margaret said slowly, "James Reeves, he died of a heart attack," the agent said. "Natural causes. Natural or not, he took his secrets with him. Except he didn't, did he? He left them all down there, like some sick museum." A car door slammed outside and they both froze. Kaiser's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Harold moved to the window, peering through the curtain. "Black sedan," he reported. "2 men in suits." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice. "Police? I don't think so. They're not moving like cops. They're just sitting there, watching the house." They remained motionless for several minutes, hardly breathing. Finally, Harold saw one of the men raise what looked like binoculars. "They're surveilling us. Why would anyone be watching us? Unless—" Margaret's voice trailed off as a horrible possibility occurred to her. Unless what? Unless James Reeves wasn't working alone. What if he had partners? What if they know about the basement and think we've found it? The implications hit Harold like a physical blow. If Reeves had accomplices, they might view Harold and Margaret as loose ends that needed to be tied up. The isolation they'd sought for their retirement paradise now felt like a trap. Kaiser began pacing, his agitation increasing. The dog had been their salvation, leading them to the truth. But now Margaret wondered if that truth would be their downfall. "We need to get out of here," Harold said, moving away from the window. "Pack what we can carry and leave. We can call the police from town." "With what car?" "We only have one, and it's parked right outside where they can see us." Harold cursed under his breath. They were effectively trapped. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and even if they could reach them, how could they explain the situation without sounding insane? Margaret gathered the photographs with shaking hands. We have to hide these. If they come looking, we can't let them find the evidence. Where? They probably know this house better than we do. She looked at Kaiser, who had stopped pacing and was now staring intently at the basement door. Not the basement. They'll check there first. But what about outside? We could bury them. In broad daylight with those men watching? The sound of car doors slamming again made them both jump. Through the window, Harold could see the two men approaching the house. They walked with purpose, their hands inside their jackets. Back door, Margaret whispered urgently. We go out the back. But as they gathered their evidence and prepared to flee, Kaiser's growl deepened. The dog was no longer looking toward the front of the house. He was staring toward the back, where footsteps could now be heard on the porch. They were surrounded, trapped in a house of horrors with nowhere to run. The retirement they'd dreamed of had become a nightmare, and Margaret realized with growing dread that they might not live to see another sunrise. The basement walls seemed to press closer as Margaret clutched the yellowed photographs, her hands trembling despite her attempts to steady them. Each image told a story she wished she'd never uncovered: missing hikers, campers who'd never returned home, faces that had once graced milk cartons and evening news broadcasts. The dates scrawled on the back stretched over nearly 2 decades. We have to call the police, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. Harold stood frozen beside the makeshift workbench, his face pale in the harsh fluorescent light. With what phone? You said yourself there's no signal up here. His voice cracked. And even if we could, Margaret, what if he comes back before they arrive? Above them, Kaiser whined softly, his massive paws padding nervously across the kitchen floor. The German shepherd's acute hearing had picked up something they couldn't detect, a sound that made his hackles rise and his body tense with protective instinct. Margaret dropped the photographs, scattering them across the concrete floor like grotesque confetti. The car keys. We need to leave, now. They turned toward the basement stairs, but Kaiser's whining transformed into a low, warning growl that froze their blood. Through the thin ceiling they heard it, the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching on the gravel drive. Oh God, Margaret breathed, grabbing Harold's arm. He's back. The engine noise grew louder, closer, until it stopped directly outside the house. A truck door slammed with metallic finality, followed by heavy footsteps on the front porch. Kaiser's growling intensified, punctuated by sharp, aggressive barks that echoed through the house. Harold's mind raced through their options. The basement had no other exit. They'd checked every wall, every corner. The narrow windows near the ceiling were too small for escape, barely wide enough for ventilation. They were trapped, with 20 years of evidence surrounding them like accusations. The workbench, Harold whispered urgently, pointing to the heavy wooden structure. Help me move it against the door. Together, they strained against the bench's weight, their retirement-weakened muscles protesting as they dragged it across the concrete. Tools clattered to the floor, hammers, saws, and instruments whose purposes Margaret didn't want to contemplate. The bench scraped and groaned until it formed a crude barricade against the basement entrance. Above them, Kaiser's barking reached a fevered pitch, accompanied by the sound of furniture being overturned and glass breaking. A man's voice cut through the chaos, deep, gravelly, filled with rage. Where are you, you trespassing bastards? I know you're in my house. Margaret pressed herself against the far wall, her heart hammering so violently she was certain it could be heard throughout the basement. Harold stood beside her, clutching a crowbar he'd retrieved from the scattered tools, his knuckles white with determination. The footsteps moved methodically through the house above, heavy boots crossing from room to room, searching. Cabinet doors slammed open, drawers were yanked from their tracks and dumped onto floors. The man was thorough, methodical, like someone accustomed to hunting. Kaiser's barks suddenly became more aggressive, followed by a human curse and the sound of something heavy hitting a wall. Margaret bit her knuckle to keep from crying out, imagining their faithful companion being hurt by this monster who'd turned their dream home into a nightmare. "I found your suitcases upstairs," the voice called out, closer now, as if he was speaking directly to them through the walls. "Nice and neat in the bedroom. Retirement money well spent, wouldn't you say?" The footsteps paused directly overhead. Through the thin ceiling they could see dust particles drifting down like snow as the man shifted his weight, apparently thinking, planning his next move. "You know," the voice continued, conversational now, almost pleasant, "I really hoped the realtor would find me buyers who minded their own business. But curiosity killed more than just cats, didn't it?" A door opened somewhere above, probably a closet being searched, then another. The man was being systematic, eliminating possibilities, narrowing down their hiding place through process of elimination. Margaret caught Harold's eye and pointed toward the photographs scattered on the floor. Without words, they both understood. This wasn't just about their survival anymore. Those faces, those families who'd never known what happened to their loved ones, they deserved justice. Harold nodded grimly and moved quietly toward the workbench, searching for anything that might serve as evidence if they somehow survived this nightmare. His fingers closed around a small leather journal wedged between two drawers, its pages filled with dates, locations, and descriptions written in careful handwriting. The footsteps stopped directly over the kitchen. A chair scraped across the floor. Then, with dawning horror, they heard the man's voice, much clearer now, speaking as if he were sitting directly above the basement entrance. "I know you found it," he said softly. "The question is, how much did you see?" The sheriff's cruiser pulled into their driveway just as the first rays of dawn broke through the forest canopy. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Deputy Torres stepped out, his face grim in the pale morning light. Behind him, a second vehicle arrived, a black SUV that made her stomach clench with recognition. "They're here," she called to Harold, who was methodically packing their few remaining belongings into cardboard boxes. They'd spent the night preparing, knowing this moment would come. Kaiser lifted his massive head from his position by the door, ears pricked forward. The dog had barely left their side since the events in the basement, as if sensing the fragile nature of their current safety. Deputy Torres knocked with the measured rhythm of official business. Margaret opened the door before he could knock a second time, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Mrs. Whitmore," Torres nodded respectfully. "I hope we're not calling too early." "Not at all. We've been expecting you." She stepped aside to let him enter, noting how his hand rested casually near his weapon. "Coffee? That would be appreciated, thank you." The second man entered without invitation, Agent Harrison from the State Bureau, the same man who'd questioned him 2 days ago about James Hendricks's disappearance. His pale eyes swept the room, cataloguing details with practiced efficiency. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," Harrison's voice carried the weight of authority. "We need to discuss some inconsistencies in your previous statements." Harold emerged from the back room, his movements careful and deliberate. At 72, he'd learned that appearing non-threatening was often the wisest course. What kind of inconsistencies? Harrison pulled out a small recording device, setting it on their kitchen table with deliberate ceremony. "We've recovered Mr. Hendricks's vehicle. It was found in a ravine about 10 miles from here, burned beyond recognition. Our forensics team is still processing the scene." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she poured coffee, but her voice remained steady. "That's terrible. Do you think he had an accident?" "That's what we're trying to determine." Harrison accepted the coffee cup without thanks. "The interesting thing is, we found evidence that someone else was at the crash site. Footprints leading away from the vehicle. Fresh ones. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire." Kaiser shifted position, his bulk moving to place himself between the agents and his family. The dog's intuition about threats had never been wrong. Torres cleared his throat uncomfortably. We also wanted to ask about your basement, the renovations you mentioned. When did those begin? Harold's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They'd rehearsed this conversation, but the reality felt different, more dangerous. We haven't done any renovations. The house came with a small root cellar, nothing more. Interesting. Harrison pulled out a folder, spreading several photographs across the table. Margaret's breath caught. They were surveillance photos taken from the forest, showing Harold carrying what looked suspiciously like concrete bags from his truck. These were taken 3 days ago by a wildlife camera we installed, after receiving reports of suspicious activity in the area. The trap was closing around them with methodical precision. Margaret realized they'd been watched longer than they'd known, their every move documented and analyzed. Those bags contained garden soil, Harold said evenly. We're preparing flower beds for spring planting. Harrison smiled, but the expression held no warmth. Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to be direct with you. We know James Hendricks came here. His cell phone pinged the nearest tower at 11:47 p.m. 3 nights ago, and the signal originated from your property. We also know he never left. Torres looked uncomfortable with his partner's aggressive approach, but remained silent. Margaret noticed his hand had moved closer to his radio. We told you before, she said, fighting to keep her voice level. We never saw him. Then you won't mind if we search the property more thoroughly. It wasn't a question. Harrison was already standing, his intention clear. Kaiser rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog's massive frame tensed, reading the escalating tension in the room with animal clarity. Easy, boy, Harold murmured, but his own muscles were coiling with nervous energy. Harrison's hand moved toward his weapon at the dog's display, and Margaret realized how quickly this could spiral beyond their control. 3 nights ago, they'd been ordinary retirees living their quiet dream. Now they stood on the precipice of losing everything. Their freedom, their future, possibly their lives. Of course, Harold said finally. Search wherever you need to. We have nothing to hide. But even as he spoke the words, Margaret caught his eye and saw her own fear reflected there. The basement held more secrets than just Hendricks's fate, and they both knew it. Some discoveries couldn't be undone, some knowledge couldn't be unknown. Harrison smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes, predatory and satisfied. Excellent. My team should be here within the hour. The floorboards groaned under Margaret's weight as she paced the living room, her arthritis forgotten in the surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Through the window, she could see Harold hunched over his phone by the old oak tree, the only spot on their property that caught a reliable signal. His free hand gestured frantically as he spoke to Detective Morrison, and even from this distance she could read the tension in his shoulders. Rex lay sprawled across the threshold between the kitchen and living room, positioned like a furry sentinel. His ears twitched at every sound, the settling of the house, the rustle of wind through the trees, the distant cry of a hawk. Since discovering the basement, their German shepherd had appointed himself their guardian, rarely leaving their side except for the most necessary of duties. Margaret's gaze drifted to the manila folder, splayed across the coffee table, its contents a grotesque catalogue of Thomas Brennan's crimes. Photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes in cramped script, all documenting the disappearances that had plagued neighboring counties over the past decade. The faces of the missing stared up at her from yellowed newsprint, a college student who'd vanished during a hiking trip, a traveling salesman whose car was found abandoned on a mountain road, a young mother who'd stepped out for groceries and never returned home. The basement door remained sealed with police tape, but Margaret could still smell the musty dampness that had wafted up from below when they'd first descended those narrow stairs. The memory made her stomach clench. The makeshift workshop with its array of tools, the chemical stains on the concrete floor, the metal table with leather restraints that had made Harold retch into the corner. But it was the journal that haunted her most. Brennan's meticulous documentation of his victims, their final hours recorded with clinical detachment. The police had taken the original, but not before Margaret had glimpsed enough to understand the true horror of what had transpired in the depths beneath their dream home. Harold's voice carried through the glass, sharp with frustration. She caught fragments. Can't stay here. Media attention. Property values. He was trying to convince Morrison that they needed protection, that once word leaked about the discovery, their quiet sanctuary would become a circus of reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and morbid curiosity seekers. Rex's head lifted suddenly, his ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he fixed his attention on something beyond the front door. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Every unexpected sound now triggered a spike of fear. Every shadow held potential menace. The rational part of her mind knew that Brennan was long gone. His trail had gone cold months ago, but her nervous system remained convinced that danger lurked behind every tree. The sound of gravel crunching under tires sent her rushing to the window. A white sedan was making its way up their winding driveway, moving slowly as if the driver was unfamiliar with the terrain. Margaret's mouth went dry as she watched the car approach. She couldn't make out the occupants through the tinted windshield. Harold appeared around the corner of the house, phone still pressed to his ear, his face pale as he spotted the approaching vehicle. He ended his call abruptly and started jogging toward the front door, his 73-year-old frame moving with surprising agility born of fear. The sedan pulled to a stop beside Harold's pickup truck. For a long moment, nothing happened. Margaret found herself holding her breath, her imagination conjuring scenarios ranging from reporters with telephoto lenses to something far more sinister. Rex was on his feet now, hackles raised, a continuous low growl emanating from his throat. The driver's door opened, and a woman in her 50s emerged. She wore a dark business suit and carried a briefcase, her expression serious but not threatening. Margaret released the breath she'd been holding as the woman approached their front door with the measured gait of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. Harold burst through the door just as the woman reached the porch steps. "Who are you?" he demanded, positioning himself protectively in front of Margaret. "Mr. and Mrs. Henley?" the woman asked, her voice professional but not unkind. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm with the district attorney's office." She reached into her jacket and produced a badge. "I need to speak with you about the discovery you made on your property." Margaret felt her knees weaken. The reality of their situation crystallized with sudden, crushing clarity. This wasn't just about finding evidence of past crimes. They were now key witnesses in what would undoubtedly become a massive criminal investigation. Their retirement, their peaceful isolation, their carefully planned golden years were officially over. "Detective Morrison said someone from your office might be in touch," Harold said, his voice strained. Chen nodded gravely. "What you've uncovered is going to help us solve multiple cold cases, but I won't lie to you, things are about to get very complicated." The sheriff's flashlight cut through the darkness of the hidden basement as Margaret and Harold followed close behind, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Deputy Chen brought up the rear, her hand resting on her service weapon. The musty air grew thicker with each step down the crude wooden stairs that creaked ominously under their weight. "Jesus Christ!" Sheriff Morrison whispered as his beam swept across the far wall. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. The wall was covered in photographs, dozens of them, all showing the same terrified faces of people who had clearly been held against their will. Below the photos, a workbench held an array of tools that made her stomach lurch. Restraints hung from hooks driven into the concrete walls. "We need to call this in immediately," Deputy Chen said, her voice tight with controlled horror. "This is a crime scene." Harold wrapped his arm around Margaret's trembling shoulders as they took in the full scope of what lay before them. In one corner, a metal chair sat bolted to the floor, dark stains surrounding its base. File cabinets lined another wall, their drawers slightly ajar as if someone had left in a hurry. "The previous owner," Margaret managed to say. "Jonathan Cray. How long did he live here?" Sheriff Morrison was already on his radio, calling for backup and the state crime scene unit. 15 years, maybe more. He answered between radio calls, kept to himself. "We all thought he was just a harmless recluse." Margaret noticed something else that made her blood run cold, a calendar on the wall with dates circled in red ink. The last marked date was only 3 weeks ago, well after Cray had supposedly moved away. "Sheriff," she said, pointing at the calendar with a shaking finger. "Look at that." Morrison followed her gaze, and his face went pale. "That's impossible. Cray moved out 2 months ago. We verified it ourselves." The sound of footsteps above them made everyone freeze, heavy boots crossing the main floor, moving with purpose toward the kitchen where they'd left the basement entrance open. "Did you call for backup already?" Harold whispered. "They can't be here yet," Morrison replied, drawing his weapon. "Chen, take Mr. and Mrs. Patterson upstairs through the back entrance we found. Now." But there was no back entrance to this basement. They all knew it. They were trapped. The footsteps stopped directly above them, and a voice called down that made Margaret's knees buckle. "Sheriff Morrison, I heard you might need some assistance." It was Jonathan Cray. "He never left," Margaret breathed. "He's been watching us this whole time." Deputy Chen positioned herself between the elderly couple and the stairs, her weapon drawn. The sheriff motioned for everyone to move toward the far corner of the basement, away from the stairs. "Jonathan," Sheriff Morrison called up, "we need to talk. Why don't you come down here so we can sort this out?" A low chuckle echoed from above. "I don't think so, Sheriff. You see, this is my home. These people are trespassing." Margaret remembered all the times she'd felt watched while working in her garden, the sensation of eyes on her from the forest. She thought of Max's constant alertness, his refusal to go near certain areas of the property. Her dog had been trying to warn them all along. "The sale was legal, Jonathan," Harold called out, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "We have the deed." "Deeds can be forged," Cray replied. "Identities can be stolen. You'd be amazed what you can accomplish when you've had 15 years to perfect your craft." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. If Cray had forged the sale documents, if he'd somehow stolen the real owner's identity, then their entire life savings, everything they'd invested in this property, was gone. But money seemed trivial compared to the immediate danger they faced. Sheriff Morrison was speaking quietly into his radio, trying to coordinate with the backup units without alerting Cray to their exact location. The static seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. "I can hear you down there, Sheriff." Cray's voice had taken on a sing-song quality that made Margaret's skin crawl. "You know, I was actually planning to relocate. Your timing is rather inconvenient." A new sound reached them, the scratch of metal against wood. Cray was doing something to the basement entrance above. "He's sealing us in," Chen whispered urgently. Margaret closed her eyes and thought of Max, probably still locked in their car outside, waiting for them to return. She thought of their quiet retirement dreams, their simple desire for peace and solitude. Instead, they'd stumbled into a nightmare that had been festering in this place for over a decade. The scratching stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that seemed to press down on them like a physical weight. The beam of Margaret's flashlight cut through the darkness as they descended into the hidden basement one final time. Rex pressed close to her legs, his ears alert but no longer showing the aggressive tension that had marked their previous encounters with this cursed space. The dog seemed to understand they were here to end something. Harold carried the gasoline can, his arthritic hands trembling slightly from both age and adrenaline. The acrid smell of accelerant mixed with the musty odor of decay that had become sickeningly familiar. Every surface they illuminated told a story of horror, the workbench with its stained restraints, the walls lined with photographs of victims, the journals documenting years of methodical evil. "The police will want evidence," Margaret whispered, though she knew her words were hollow. They'd already discussed this during their sleepless night. Detective Morrison had made it clear that without proof of recent criminal activity, the department's resources were limited. A dead serial killer's lair was a historical curiosity, not an active crime scene. "Evidence won't bring those people justice," Harold replied, unscrewing the cap. "And it won't give us our peace back." Margaret watched her husband of 43 years begin dousing the basement systematically. The gasoline splashed against the concrete walls, pooled around the base of the workbench, and soaked into every crevice where darkness had festered. She understood his logic, even as part of her mourned what they were about to destroy. The house above them groaned, as if sensing its fate. They'd spent the morning removing their few possessions, loading everything into their old Honda Civic with the efficiency of people who had learned to live with less. Their retirement dream had become a nightmare, but they'd salvaged what mattered most, each other. Rex whined softly and moved toward the stairs, his instincts warning him away from the danger they were creating. Margaret followed, but Harold remained below, methodically completing his work. The beam of his flashlight danced across walls that had witnessed unspeakable acts, across tools that had served purposes too terrible to contemplate. 47 years he lived here, Harold muttered. 47 years of neighbors thinking he was just a quiet man who kept to himself. Margaret knew he was thinking about all the times people had said the same thing about them. Quiet, private, keeping to themselves. The realization that such descriptions could mask either innocence or absolute evil had shaken something fundamental in Harold's worldview. The gasoline can clattered empty against the concrete floor. Harold climbed the stairs slowly, his breathing labored from the fumes and exertion. At the top, Margaret helped him close the hidden panel one last time. The house above felt different now, charged with potential energy like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. They stood in what had once been their living room, surrounded by the echoes of interrupted domesticity. Margaret could still picture where their couch had sat, where Harold's reading chair had faced the window overlooking the forest. For 3 weeks this had been home. Now it was simply a structure containing evil they were about to purge. Harold struck the first match and watched it flare to life. "You sure about this, Maggie?" She nodded, though her throat felt too tight for words. They'd talked through every alternative during the long night. Selling meant passing the burden to another unsuspecting family. Staying meant living forever in the shadow of what they'd discovered. This was the only path that led to any kind of peace. The match fell through the gap around the hidden panel, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. Then orange light bloomed beneath the floorboards, followed by a rushing sound like an enormous inhale. The basement became a furnace, and heat began radiating up through the house with startling speed. They ran then, Rex bounding ahead of them as smoke began seeping through cracks in the flooring. The forest around the house seemed to exhale in relief as flames found windows and began reaching toward the canopy above. Margaret looked back once to see fire consuming what had been their bedroom, erasing the space where they'd lain awake listening to Rex's warnings they'd been too naive to understand. The Honda started on the second try, and Harold drove them down the winding dirt road without looking in the rearview mirror. Rex sat between them, his massive head resting on Margaret's shoulder, finally calm. Behind them, smoke rose above the tree line like a signal fire, announcing the end of something that should have ended decades ago. The house would be gone by morning, along with its basement full of horrors and its walls that had absorbed too many secrets. Margaret reached across Rex to touch Harold's arm. They'd lost their savings, their dream, and their innocence about human nature. But they'd kept their lives and their love for each other. In the gathering darkness ahead, that felt like enough to begin again. The road stretched out before them, leading away from the fire and toward whatever uncertain future awaited. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of their cramped rental apartment as Margaret packed the last of their belongings into cardboard boxes. 6 months had passed since they'd fled the forest house, and the nightmares were finally beginning to fade. Rex lay on his favorite blanket, watching her with those intelligent brown eyes that had saved their lives. "The insurance settlement came through," Harold announced, waving the envelope as he entered the kitchen. His voice carried a lightness that had been absent for months. "It's enough for a fresh start." Margaret looked up from the box of dishes, a genuine smile crossing her face for the first time in weeks. "Really? Really? We can put a down payment on that little house near the coast, the one with the garden you loved." Harold set the check on the counter and pulled her into his arms. No basements, no dark secrets, just us, Rex, and the sound of the ocean. The federal investigation had concluded 3 weeks ago. Detective Chen had called to inform them that the remains of 17 victims had been identified, with families finally receiving closure after years of uncertainty. The previous owner's journals revealed a 20-year killing spree that had gone undetected due to his careful selection of transients and runaways. The house had been demolished, the property designated as a memorial site. I still can't believe we almost... Margaret shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. But we didn't, Harold said firmly, stroking her silver hair. Rex made sure of that. As if understanding the conversation, the German shepherd lifted his head and padded over to them, tail wagging slowly. Harold reached down to scratch behind his ears. Good boy. Our hero. The phone rang, interrupting the moment. Margaret glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It's Detective Chen. Harold's stomach tightened as Margaret answered. They'd hoped their connection to the case was finally over. Mrs. Pemberton? I'm calling with good news. Chen's voice was clear, even through the speakerphone. We've recovered several valuable items from the property that belonged to victims' families. There's also a reward from the FBI for information leading to the resolution of multiple missing person cases. Your discovery helped close more cases than we initially realized. Margaret and Harold exchanged glances. How much? Harold asked. $50,000. I have the paperwork ready for you to sign. After they hung up, Margaret sank into a chair, overwhelmed. It's like the universe is trying to make up for what we went through, or rewarding us for surviving it, Harold replied. He pulled out the real estate listings they'd been studying. This changes everything. We could buy the coastal house outright. No mortgage, no financial stress. Rex wandered over to his food bowl, and Harold realized it was nearly empty. As he refilled it, memories of those terrifying nights in the forest house flashed through his mind. The sound of footsteps above them in the hidden room, the smell of fear and decay, the certainty that they might not survive to see morning. But they had survived, and they'd prevented future victims from suffering the same fate. The realtor called yesterday, Margaret said, breaking his reverie. The coastal house is still available. We could drive down this weekend to take another look. I'd like that. Harold sat beside her, taking her hand. Her fingers were steadier now, no longer trembling at unexpected sounds. Are you ready for this? To start over? Margaret considered the question seriously. I think so. For months I was angry that our dream retirement had been stolen from us, but maybe this is better. We know what we're capable of now. We know we can face the worst and still choose to build something beautiful. That afternoon they drove to the ocean to walk along the shore. Rex bounded through the waves, barking joyfully at the seabirds. The sound of his happiness was a balm to their healing souls. Harold watched his wife collect shells, her face peaceful in the salt air. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never found that basement? Margaret asked as they sat on a piece of driftwood. Sometimes. But then I think about those families who finally have answers, about the people who won't become victims because that monster can't hurt anyone else. Harold threw a piece of seaweed for Rex to chase. We were meant to find it, Maggie. As horrible as it was, we were meant to be there. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Margaret leaned against her husband's shoulder. The coastal house has that big fenced yard for Rex, and the garden shed you want to convert into a pottery studio. And no basement. Definitely no basement. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the waves roll endlessly toward shore. Tomorrow they would sign the papers, collect their reward, and begin the next chapter of their lives. But tonight they were simply grateful to be alive, together, and free. Rex trotted back to them, dropping a piece of driftwood at their feet, a gift from their faithful guardian who had led them through darkness into light.